My name is Arthur Caldwell, and I turned 72 last winter, a fact that seems to surprise people when they first meet me because I still walk upright. My hair, though thinned and streaked heavily with gray, has not completely abandoned me, and my mind, at least from inside my own skull, feels as sharp as when I used to stand in front of a classroom explaining to restless teenagers the tangled paths of American history. Yet once the pleasantries are done and strangers learn that I am widowed, that I live alone in the same creaking house my wife and I bought in 1973, that I eat most of my meals at the small kitchen table with the chair opposite permanently empty, their smiles soften into pitying looks, and I sense them placing me into that invisible category of the elderly. A man whose time is seen as largely behind him, whose future has narrowed to the predictable arc of waiting for the end. I resent that categorization, though I admit there are mornings when my joints ache so badly that I shuffle to the bathroom like the very stereotype I despise, and there are evenings when silence presses down so heavily that I wonder if perhaps those strangers are right and my life really has dwindled to something small and nearly finished. The house itself tells my story better than I can. Its walls are lined with bookcases, still filled with the volumes I collected during 4 decades as a teacher. Battered history textbooks, biographies of presidents, leather-bound editions of the Federalist Papers, and Lincoln speeches, all marked, with marginal notes in my cramped handwriting. In the dining room, though no guests come anymore, the long oak table still waits, polished but unused, its surface carrying faint rings from glasses placed there during long-ago holidays when my wife Margaret would cook enough food to feed half the neighborhood and our son, Michael. Then a boy with wild curls and a permanent grin would sneak turkey legs under the table to feed our dog. The photographs on the mantelpiece remain unchanged. Our wedding portrait from 1968, me in a cheap suit and her in a lace dress she sewed herself. A picture of Michael in Little League uniform holding a bat twice his size. Another of him graduating. From law school, my arm proud around his shoulder. Time has carried us far from those moments, but the images hang suspended in glass, refusing to admit what has happened since. Margaret has been gone for almost a decade now, a heart attack that struck her without warning on a chilly March morning while she was hanging laundry in the backyard. I found her collapsed beside the basket, her hands still clutching a damp bedsheet, her face tilted toward the spring sky. They told me she died instantly, without suffering, but I have never been able to silence the thought that perhaps she had one terrible moment of awareness, one final cry for help that I did not hear. Grief is a slow corrosion. It eats at you, not in a single moment, but through thousands of small reminders. The smell of her perfume still lingering on the closet door, the way the bed dips slightly on her side, though it has been empty for years, the recipes in her handwriting tucked into kitchen drawers. For months after she passed, I set a plate for her at dinner out of habit and then carried it back to the sink untouched, whispering apologies into the void. People told me I should remarry, join a club, travel, keep myself busy, but those words fell flat. What I wanted was the impossible, her voice calling my name from the garden, her laughter during Sunday crossword puzzles, her hand on mine at night. Michael, our only child, came less and less after his mother's funeral. At first he excused himself with the demands of his practice in the city, then with the distance, though we lived only an hour apart. Phone calls dwindled to birthdays and major holidays, and even then his tone carried an impatience, as though speaking with me were another appointment to be checked off his calendar. I tried not to take it personally. I reminded myself that he had built a successful career as a lawyer, that he had a family of his own, that perhaps my presence reminded him too much of loss. Still, there were nights when I sat in my recliner staring at the silent telephone, waiting for it to ring, telling myself that tomorrow he would call. Tomorrow often stretched into weeks. I cannot claim I was a perfect father. When Michael was a boy, I often put my energy into my students, spending late evenings preparing lectures or advising debate teams, while at home I sometimes answered him with half my attention, my nose buried in lesson plans. Margaret filled in the gaps, the warm parent who attended every game and remembered every detail of his friends and hobbies. I was proud of him, but awkward in showing it, and I suppose that awkwardness calcified into distance as he grew. Still, I believed that deep beneath the layers of time and reserve, there remained the bond of blood, the recognition that whatever our flaws, we were father and son, bound not only by law and memory, but by something elemental. In recent years, that belief has been tested. There were subtle changes at first. The way Michael asked casually about my finances, the suggestion that perhaps my old house was too much for me, that I might consider selling it and moving into a retirement community. His questions came wrapped in concern, but I detected a note of calculation, as if he were already measuring the value of the property, imagining how the proceeds might be distributed. When I brushed off the idea, telling him that the house was my anchor, he laughed and changed the subject, but the look in his eyes lingered. A few months later, he brought me glossy brochures for assisted living facilities, saying he had toured them himself. I shoved them into a drawer, where they still lie unopened. My days have settled into a routine that is both comforting and stifling. I wake early, as teachers never lose the habit, brew a pot of coffee, and read the morning paper at the kitchen table, circling articles that interest me, though there is no one to discuss them with. Sometimes I walk through the neighborhood, cane in hand, greeting neighbors who nod politely but keep moving. In the afternoons I read, sometimes the classics I taught, sometimes new histories to keep my mind engaged. Evenings are the hardest. The hours stretch long and silent, and I find myself watching old films on television, not so much for entertainment as for the illusion of voices filling the house. When I go to bed, I trace the outline of the empty pillow beside me with my hand, whispering good night to a ghost. There are moments of brightness. My garden, though more modest than in Margaret's days, still produces roses that bloom fiercely each June, their scent drifting through the open windows. Former students occasionally send letters, thanking me for encouraging them to pursue law or history, and those notes remind me that my life once had impact beyond these walls. I keep them in a shoebox, rereading them on lonely nights. But such moments cannot fully counterbalance the undercurrent of solitude, the nagging sense that I am slowly being erased from the life of my own family. It was against this backdrop that Michael called me one evening not long ago. The call came later than usual, nearly 11 o'clock, when I'd already settled into bed with a book. His voice was brisk, almost hurried, as though he had rehearsed the words. He told me there would be a hearing in court the following morning, a matter concerning paperwork after Margaret's estate, and he mentioned it in a way that suggested routine, nothing for me to worry about. Yet before hanging up, his tone shifted, and he added almost sharply, "Dad, don't come to court tomorrow. It's not necessary, and honestly, it would be better if you stayed home." There was no explanation, no space for questions, just the click of the line going dead. I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, the words repeating in my head. Why, I asked myself, would my own son not want me present at a hearing involving my late wife's estate, the woman who had shared my life for over 40 years? What could be discussed there that required my absence? The request, or rather the command, struck me not as protection but as exclusion, and a chill settled in my chest. By morning, I had decided that despite his warning, I would attend. After all, whatever the matter was, it concerned me as much as him. And though he might be a successful lawyer, I was still his father, not a client to be managed, nor a child to be dismissed. The following morning broke cold and grey, the kind of morning when the air feels heavy and the streets appear strangely hushed, as though the town itself were holding its breath, and I moved through my routines more deliberately than usual, lingering over the coffee pot, staring out the window at the skeletal branches of the maple tree that Margaret had planted half a century ago, thinking about Michael's late-night words and trying to decide whether I should obey or defy them. There was a part of me that wanted to shrink back into the safety of my worn armchair, tell myself that perhaps he was right, perhaps I would only embarrass him with my presence, my slow gait, my old-fashioned clothes, my tendency to speak too, frankly. Yet there was another part, stronger and fiercer, that insisted that my life and my dignity were not his to control, that whatever business was being conducted in that courtroom involved me as much as it did him, and that if I stayed away, I would be colluding in my own erasure by the time I dressed in my best suit, a brown tweed relic that still carried faint traces of mothballs. I had made my decision. I would go, not as a disruptive gesture, not to embarrass him, but to witness with my own eyes what he seemed so desperate to hide. The courthouse was a grand brick building downtown, one I had not entered in years, and as I approached its steps, I felt the odd mix of fear and determination that used to grip me before walking into a classroom on the first day of school. Inside, the marble floor echoed with hurried footsteps. Attorneys in tailored suits passed briskly with their briefcases, and a few nervous families sat on wooden benches whispering among themselves. I asked the clerk at the desk about the hearing involving Michael Caldwell, and when she glanced up at me, her eyes widened as though she recognized the name, and she directed me to courtroom 3. I slipped inside quietly and took a seat in the back row, my heart thudding with the nervous energy of someone who knows he is not entirely welcome. At the front, I saw my son already standing at the counsel's table, his hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate, his expression calm and controlled. He had not noticed me yet, but the sight of him standing there, confident in command, filled me with a strange blend of pride and unease, because though I had once cradled him in my arms as an infant, teaching him how to walk, how to ride a bicycle, how to drive a car, here he was presenting himself as a man of authority, while I sat hidden in the back like an intruder. Then I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The documents spread before him on the table were not only marked with Margaret's name, but with mine. I could make out the faint lettering on the cover sheet, words like petition, guardianship, and competency. I blinked, leaned forward, convinced that my aging eyes were deceiving me, but the words remained, stark and undeniable. My son, my only son, had filed a petition to be appointed as my guardian, a legal arrangement reserved for the senile and incapacitated, those deemed unfit to manage their own affairs. I sat frozen, my mouth dry, unable to process the betrayal. As the proceedings began, the judge entered, robes flowing, and I recognized him with a jolt that felt almost surreal. Judge Anthony Hughes had once been a gangly teenager in my sophomore history class, the boy who stayed after school to ask about the Civil War and who, in his final essay, had written passionately about the moral weight of justice. I'd not seen him in decades, and now here he was elevated to a position where my fate could rest in his hands. Our eyes met briefly, and I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, but the formality of the courtroom quickly closed over it. Michael spoke smoothly, presenting his petition with the polished authority of a man accustomed to persuading juries. He spoke of my age, of what he described as my increasing forgetfulness, of supposed lapses in judgment. He mentioned that I lived alone in a large and decaying house, that I had once left the stove on for hours, that I had confused bank statements, that I had repeated the same story to him twice in one conversation. Each statement struck me like a blow, because though every life contains moments of absent-mindedness, he wove them into a portrait of someone unraveling, someone unable to care for himself. I wanted to stand up and shout that it was not true, that I cooked my meals safely, that my bank accounts were balanced down to the penny, that my memory, though occasionally slow, was intact. But I forced myself to remain silent, waiting for the moment when the judge would ask for my side. Then he produced a document, a medical certificate stamped and signed, declaring that I was showing signs of early dementia. I stared at the page from across the room, my body rigid with disbelief, because I had never been diagnosed with any such condition, never even been tested, and the doctor whose signature appeared there was a name I did not recognize. The realization that my son had gone so far as to fabricate evidence, or at the very least manipulate the truth, made me dizzy. For a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the bench, that perhaps he would get his wish after all by watching me humiliate myself in public. But something inside me, a stubborn ember that Margaret used to say was both my strength and my flaw, flared up. I would not go down in silence. When Judge Hughes asked if there were any witnesses to speak on my behalf, I rose from the bench, cane in hand, my knees shaking but my voice steady, and said, "Your Honor, I am Arthur Caldwell, the man named in that petition. I would like to speak." The entire courtroom seemed to shift as heads turned, and Michael's face, when he saw me, froze in shock, then hardened into anger. "Dad," he hissed under his breath, though I was too far to hear the words. "What are you doing here?" The judge motioned me forward, and though my steps were slow, I walked with as much dignity as I could summon until I stood not in the back row, but beside the bench itself, close enough to see the lines of age in the judge's face and to smell the faint polish of the wood. Hughes studied me carefully, perhaps remembering the man who once urged him to believe in the weight of truth, and he nodded for me to continue. In that moment, the strange puzzle of Michael's warning crystallized into clarity. He had not told me to stay away for my own comfort or out of kindness. He had wanted me absent so he could speak over me, define me in absentia, paint me as incapable without risk of contradiction. His plan required my silence, my compliance, my willingness to stay hidden at home while he dismantled my life piece by piece. By walking into that courtroom, by daring to stand beside the judge, I'd already defied him in the most fundamental way, and as I drew breath to speak, feeling the collective eyes of the courtroom upon me, I understood that whatever else might happen, the next words would determine not only the outcome of the hearing, but the fragile remains of my relationship with the only child I had left. When I began to speak, I could feel the tremor in my hands and the dryness in my throat, yet the words came out with a force that surprised even me, as though all the months and years of silence, of swallowing disappointment and humiliation, had gathered behind a dam and now burst forth in one unstoppable flood. I told the court that I was 72 years old, yes, and that I lived alone in the same house where I had raised my son, and that I still cooked my meals, read my books, paid my bills, and kept my affairs in order without assistance from anyone. I explained that absent-minded moments were not the same as incapacity, that every man of every age repeats stories from time to time, and that the incident of the stove he described had never happened. In fact, I had installed a new smoke detector myself the previous spring and had the electrician confirm that all my wiring was safe. As I spoke, I felt a steadiness return to me, a sense of clarity that Michael's petition had attempted to strip away, and I looked directly at Judge Hughes, who listened with his chin resting lightly on his hand, the same posture he had once adopted as a teenager when considering some historical debate in my classroom. Michael tried to interrupt, objecting that I was rambling and confused, but Hughes silenced him with a raised hand, reminding him that I had the right to respond to the allegations. I went on, detailing the organization of my finances, the methodical way I kept records, the precise memory I had of the last time Michael visited, which, I reminded the court, had been not for my benefit but to obtain my signature on certain banking documents that I now suspected served his purposes more than mine. The courtroom was quiet except for my voice, and for the first time in many years, I felt truly heard. Yet beneath my words ran the steady drumbeat of fear, because I knew that logic and truth alone might not be enough. Michael was a trained lawyer, polished, articulate, skilled in manipulation, and he would not relinquish his case without striking back. When I finished, he rose smoothly, his expression a mask of professional concern, and he began to dismantle me piece by piece, his tone courteous but edged with disdain. He spoke of how age often brought denial, how many elderly parents insisted they were fine while their lives crumbled around them, how children had to make difficult choices for their safety. He gestured toward me as though presenting evidence, painting me as stubborn, prideful, and blind to my own decline. Each sentence was designed to sting, and I could feel the murmurs ripple through the courtroom as his words painted a picture of a frail old man who refused to accept reality. Then came the first humiliation, subtle but sharp. He called 2 neighbors as witnesses, people I barely knew beyond exchanging greetings across the hedge. They testified that they had seen me wandering the street at dusk, appearing disoriented, that I had once asked what day of the week it was, that my garden was overgrown compared to years past. Their words, though rooted in half-truths or simple misunderstandings, carried weight because they were offered with the sheen of credibility. I wanted to shout that every man forgets the day once in a while, that my knees sometimes forced me to rest halfway down the block, that neglecting roses during a hot spell was not evidence of madness, but I forced myself to remain composed. Still, I could feel the court tilting against me, the first signs of a tide turning. Michael then introduced bank statements pointing to minor errors, small arithmetic slips I had already corrected, presenting them as proof of financial incompetence. He even mentioned that I had once sent him a birthday card dated with the wrong year, holding it up dramatically as though a smudged number were a diagnosis. I felt my cheeks burn as laughter rippled faintly from the benches. I had not felt such raw humiliation since my early years as a teacher when unruly students mocked me. Except now it was not children but my own flesh and blood leading the derision. Judge Hughes, however, did not laugh. He leaned forward and asked me a series of questions about dates, about history, about my daily routine. And I answered each with precision, recalling not only events but their context, reciting historical facts with the same cadence I once used in the classroom. At one point, I quoted Lincoln's second inaugural address by memory, and the hush that followed told me that at least some in the room recognized that my mind was intact. Michael's jaw tightened, his polished confidence beginning to crack. But he was not finished. He introduced the medical certificate again, pressing the point that a professional had diagnosed me with dementia. I demanded to know the name of the doctor, and when he said it aloud, I realized I had never met such a person. My pulse quickened as I understood that he had either coerced or bribed someone to sign a false document. "That is a lie," I said clearly, my voice echoing across the courtroom. "And you know it, Michael. I have never been treated by that doctor, and I demand an independent examination." The judge nodded gravely, noting my objection for the record, but the damage lingered like a stain. At that moment, I saw in my son's eyes not concern, not love disguised as stern duty, but calculation, the cold determination of a man who saw me not as his father, but as an obstacle to be managed. The realization cut deeper than any words. This was not merely a legal maneuver. It was a betrayal at the most intimate level, an attempt to strip me of my identity, my autonomy, my dignity. For years I had tolerated distance, neglect, even subtle insults, telling myself he was busy, that he loved me in his own way. Now before the eyes of the court, that illusion collapsed. I looked around the room, at the strangers watching our family drama unfold as though it were a play, and I felt an odd mixture of shame and resolve. I thought of Margaret, of how she had believed in fairness, in truth, in standing firm even when the world tried to bend you. I remembered her saying once during a difficult year that the only real defeat is when you let someone else define who you are. I held on to that memory like a shield. The judge announced that proceedings would continue the following day with further testimony, and that in the meantime he would review the evidence and consider my request for an independent medical evaluation. The gavel struck, and the room began to empty, but Michael remained at his table, gathering his papers with clipped, angry motions. I approached slowly, leaning on my cane, and when he finally looked at me, his eyes blazed with fury. "I told you not to come," he whispered, his voice low but seething. "You've ruined everything." I stood there, my heart breaking, and said quietly, "No, Michael. You ruined it when you chose to treat me as an enemy instead of a father." He turned away, unwilling to meet my gaze, and for the first time I understood that whatever bond remained between us had been fundamentally severed. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light, the city sounds swirling around me, I felt the weight of humiliation pressing down, yet also the first stirrings of something fierce and unyielding. The battle had only begun, and I knew it would wound me further before it ended, but I also knew I would not surrender. If my son wanted to prove me incapable, he would have to do so against my voice, my memory, my presence. I would not vanish into silence. That night I hardly slept, lying awake in the darkness with the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, my mind replaying every word of the hearing and every look that passed across my son's face, trying to understand how we had arrived at such a terrible crossroads. And as the hours crept on, I found myself drifting back through memories of him as a child, the way he used to run across the yard clutching a baseball glove, the way he fell asleep in the back seat on long family drives with his head resting against Margaret's shoulder, the way he once told me at 12 years old that he wanted to be a lawyer because he believed lawyers fought for justice. To reconcile that innocent boy with the man who now brandished forged medical papers against me was almost impossible. And yet I knew I had to accept the truth of what he had become rather than cling to the image of what he once was. When morning came, pale and gray through the curtains, I dressed again in my tweed suit and walked to the courthouse with a heaviness in my chest that was more than age. It was the weight of betrayal pressing down with every step. The courtroom was fuller this time, word having spread perhaps that a dramatic contest between father and son was unfolding, and when I took my seat, I could feel curious eyes studying me, assessing whether I looked senile or defiant. Michael entered briskly, his papers neatly arranged, his jaw set with determination, and when his gaze fell upon me there was no warmth, only a cold recognition of an adversary. Judge Hughes began the session by addressing the contested medical certificate, announcing that in light of my objection he would order an independent evaluation by court-appointed specialists. And for a moment relief surged through me, because at least the truth of my mind would not be determined by a forged document. Yet that relief was quickly tempered as Michael stood to introduce what he called further corroborating testimony, and I braced myself for another round of half-truths and distortions. He called to the stand a woman I knew only faintly, a teller from the local bank, who claimed that I'd once forgotten my own account number and required repeated assistance to complete a simple withdrawal. I wanted to shout that anyone might forget a string of digits, that account numbers were long and easily confused, but her calm, professional tone carried weight. He then produced an old family friend, someone Margaret had once invited to church suppers, who declared that during a visit I had asked him twice in the same hour whether he still lived in the same house, interpreting that repetition as a sign of decline rather than distraction. Each piece by itself was minor, almost laughable, but together they wove a net meant to ensnare me in the image of a man slipping into confusion. And then came the true turning point, the moment that split my world in two. Michael requested permission to present a letter supposedly written by Margaret before her death, in which she allegedly expressed concern about my forgetfulness and pleaded with him to watch over me. My breath caught in my throat as he unfolded the page, its handwriting faintly resembling hers but not quite, the strokes too stiff, the spacing unnatural. I felt a wave of nausea, because whether it was an outright forgery or a real letter twisted out of context, it was her voice being summoned against me, her memory bent into a weapon to strip me of my dignity. I rose shakily and objected, my words trembling but firm, declaring that Margaret had never written such a letter, that she had trusted me until her last breath, that dragging her name into this proceeding was an act of cruelty beyond measure. The courtroom was hushed, and for a moment I thought my voice alone might shatter the falsehood. Judge Hughes studied the paper carefully, his brows furrowed, and then looked back at me with a question in his eyes, the kind of question a former student might ask of a teacher. Did I believe in my own truth enough to defend it fully here? I met his gaze and answered steadily that if the court wished, I would submit samples of Margaret's authentic letters from our years together, that I had dozens of them tucked away, each filled with the warmth and wit of her real voice, none of them ever suggesting that I was incapable or unfit. He nodded, clearly unsettled by the document presented by my son, and ordered it held for handwriting analysis. At that instant, I saw Michael's composure falter, his shoulders stiffening, his mouth tightening, the realization dawning that the weapon he thought would deliver the final blow had instead raised suspicion against him. And it was in that subtle shift that I recognized the true crisis point of this battle. The moment when it was no longer only about whether I could defend my competence, but whether the court would begin to see his motives as tainted, his hunger for control too obvious. As the session recessed, I stepped outside into the cold air, my cane planted firmly on the stone steps, and I felt both drained and strangely strengthened. My son had reached into the grave to conscript his mother's memory against me, and though the pain of that betrayal cut deeper than any wound, it also steeled my resolve. Whatever affection lingered for him as a son had been eclipsed by the necessity of defending myself not just as a father, but as a man who refused to be erased. I knew then that the battle ahead would not only test my endurance, but would decide the shape of my remaining years, whether I would live them in freedom and dignity, or under the shadow of a false guardianship constructed by the very child I had raised. When the court reconvened 2 days later, I arrived with a satchel under my arm, filled with the letters Margaret had written to me across the long course of our marriage. Some from our earliest days when we were young and idealistic. Others from quiet afternoons when she left small notes on the kitchen table, and still others from later years when she wrote to me from her trips to visit her sister. All of them filled with her unmistakable handwriting, her flourishes and loops, her affectionate sign-offs that always ended with love, your Maggie. I had spent the night before reading them aloud to myself, one after another, hearing her voice return to me in ink and paper, and though it broke my heart to revisit them under such circumstances, it also renewed my conviction that no forged or twisted letter could erase the truth of the life we had built together. When Judge Hughes admitted them into evidence for comparison, I saw Michael's jaw tighten ever so slightly, the only outward sign that he recognized the trap had sprung against him, that his attempt to weaponize her memory had backfired. Yet my son, seasoned in the art of litigation, did not falter for long. He shifted tactics, as I expected he would, and what followed was a series of assaults not upon my memory or my wife's letters, but upon the very fabric of my life, as though he intended to dismantle me piece by piece until nothing remained but the shell of an old man unable to withstand the scrutiny. He presented photographs of my house, taken without my knowledge, showing peeling paint on the back porch, clutter in the garage, a lawn grown too long after a week of rain, and he described them to the court not as the ordinary imperfections of any lived-in home, but as evidence of neglect and decay. He claimed that the house itself was unsafe, that loose boards and faulty steps posed a risk to me, that my refusal to hire constant help demonstrated poor judgment. I wanted to shout that I had repaired those steps myself, that the clutter in the garage was nothing more than boxes of old teaching materials waiting to be sorted, but he spoke so quickly, so smoothly, that each image became another nail in the coffin of his argument. Then he produced financial records, not of mistakes, but of generosity, holding up copies of checks I'd written to him over the years. Small amounts for his birthdays when he was younger, larger sums later when he struggled after law school, and finally the tens of thousands I'd given when he and his wife purchased their home. He framed those gifts not as the support of a father, but as evidence of exploitation, suggesting that I had been manipulated into draining my savings recklessly, that my willingness to part with money showed impaired judgment. It was an audacious argument, twisting his own requests into proof of my weakness, and as he laid them before the judge, I felt both fury and sorrow, because every check I had signed had been written with love, with the hope of lightening his burdens, and now he used them as shackles against me. To strengthen his case, he introduced testimony from his wife, a woman who had once smiled politely across holiday tables, who now took the stand with rehearsed concern, speaking of how I sometimes repeated myself on the phone, how I once misplaced a birthday card, how she feared for my safety living alone. Her words were delivered in the tone of a dutiful daughter-in-law, but beneath the veneer I could hear the calculation, the desire to paint me as helpless, and it sickened me to see how readily she played her part in this betrayal. The audience in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that what unfolded was not the impartial concern of a family, but the cold orchestration of people determined to seize control. As the attacks mounted, I felt moments of doubt creep in. Each witness, each photograph, each twisted fact chipped away at my confidence, and there were moments when I wondered whether the accumulation of small humiliations might outweigh the truth. But then I remembered Margaret's words written in one of those very letters. "Arthur, never let the noise of others drown out the truth you know in your heart." I carried that line with me like armor, and when my turn came again, I stood slowly but firmly and answered every charge. I explained the repairs I had made, the routines I followed, the systems I had kept for decades to organize my life. I reminded the court that generosity was not incompetence, that a father's willingness to help his son was not proof of decline, but of devotion. It was then that I saw something unexpected begin to shift in Judge Hughes' expression. He was not only listening to the words, but studying the motives behind them, weighing not only my capacity, but Michael's intentions, and I realized that the more Michael pressed, the more desperate his arguments appeared. Still, the process was grueling, and by the time the day ended, I felt as though I had been stripped bare before the world, my private life dissected and displayed as though I were no longer a man, but a case file. The escalation did not end there. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught wind of the unusual case of a son petitioning against his father began to gather, their cameras flashing, their questions intrusive. "Mr. Caldwell, do you suffer from dementia?" "Mr. Caldwell, is it true your son is trying to protect you?" Their voices swirled around me like vultures, and I had to push through them with my cane, refusing to answer, feeling both exposed and angry. That evening, a neighbor called to tell me that Michael had given a statement to the press, presenting himself as a concerned son acting only out of love, claiming that my objections were the tragic denial of a once brilliant man. Reading those words in the paper the next morning nearly broke me, because to the outside world he appeared noble, while I was cast as a confused old man lashing out at kindness. But the most devastating blow came later that week, when I discovered that Michael had attempted to freeze one of my bank accounts pending the outcome of the guardianship petition, claiming it was necessary to prevent financial mismanagement. I learned of it when I tried to withdraw money to pay a routine bill and was told the account was restricted. The humiliation of having to explain, of having to call the bank and insist that I was still the legal owner of my own funds, left me shaking with rage. In that moment, I understood fully what his endgame was, not merely to claim guardianship, but to strip me of every means of independence until I was entirely at his mercy. It was in that dark hour that an unexpected ally emerged. a former colleague from my teaching days, now an attorney in semi-retirement, reached out after hearing of the case. He offered his assistance, insisting that no man should be forced to defend himself alone against such betrayal. With his guidance, I began to prepare not only rebuttals to Michael's claims, but evidence of my son's motives, gathering records of the times he had solicited money, the inconsistencies in his testimony, the dubious origins of the forged medical document. It was a painful process, reliving every instance of exploitation, but it also gave me strength, for it reminded me that I was not powerless, that truth could still be marshaled as a weapon of my own. The second escalation had revealed the full scope of Michael's intentions. Not content merely to question my competence, he sought to dismantle every aspect of my life, to twist generosity into weakness, independence into neglect, memory into confusion. Yet in pushing so far, he had exposed himself, and though the battle left me bruised and weary, I sensed that the tide might yet turn. The cost would be high, for the wounds between father and son cut deeper with each passing day, but I resolved that I would endure not only for myself, but for the memory of the woman who had believed in me, the woman whose letters now lay in. Evidence, silent yet unyielding testimony, that I was still the man she had loved. The day of the final hearing arrived with the kind of tense stillness that settles over the world just before a storm. The sky overcast, the air heavy, and as I walked slowly up the courthouse steps with my cane in one hand and the satchel of documents in the other, I felt not only the physical weight of my years, but the spiritual burden of what lay ahead, knowing that the confrontation to come would decide not only my independence, but the very shape of the relationship between father and son, whatever fragments of it might survive this ordeal. The courtroom was crowded, filled with curious onlookers and reporters, their pens ready to record the spectacle. And as I took my seat, I could feel their eyes on me, judging whether I looked fragile, whether I looked like a man losing his grip on reality. Michael stood already at his table, his suit impeccable, his papers aligned in neat stacks, his expression calm and professional, yet behind that mask, I sensed the fury simmering, the conviction that he would not allow his carefully constructed case to collapse. Judge Hughes entered, his face stern and the gavel struck, calling us to order. He announced that the independent evaluation of my mental capacity had been completed by 2 specialists, both of whom concluded that I showed no evidence of dementia or significant cognitive decline. And for a moment, the air shifted. The first crack, appearing in the fortress Michael had built. My son tried to object, to raise questions about methodology, but the judge silenced him, reminding him that the evaluations were conducted under court authority. Then came my turn, the moment I had dreaded yet longed for, when I was called to the stand to speak fully, not in fragments or rebuttals, but in testimony of my own life, my own mind. I rose carefully, my knees stiff but my back straight, and I walked the slow path to the witness box, feeling the eyes of the entire room upon me. When I sat and placed my hand upon the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, I felt a steadiness descend, as though Margaret herself were with me, whispering courage into my ear. I began by telling the story of my life, not as a list of defenses, but as a narrative of continuity, of responsibility, of clarity. I described my decades as a teacher, the hundreds of students I had guided, the countless lessons prepared, the meticulous notes I kept. I spoke of my routines at home, the order of my days, the care with which I maintained my accounts, the books I still read and discussed with former colleagues. I quoted passages of history from memory, not to show off, but to demonstrate the richness of a mind still alive. And then I spoke of Margaret, of the love we had shared, of the letters she had written me, holding one aloft and reading aloud her words about strength and truth. The courtroom was silent except for my voice, and I saw even the reporters lower their pens for a moment, listening not to a case but to a man defending his dignity. When Michael cross-examined me, he tried every tactic, pressing on small inconsistencies, asking me dates and figures with the hope that I would falter, but each time I paused, gathered my memory, and answered with precision. When he asked me the date of his graduation from law school, I gave not only the day but the weather that morning, the speech the dean delivered, the tie I had worn. He blinked, caught off guard, and tried again, asking me the balance of my last bank statement, and I answered with the exact figure down to the cents, producing the paper from my satchel to confirm it. With each exchange, the strength drained from his posture, and the image he had tried to paint of a confused old man crumbled visibly before the eyes of the court. But the climax did not come from me alone. My attorney, the old colleague who had come to my aid, rose with quiet authority and began to present evidence not of my decline but of Michael's motives. He laid out the records of financial transfers, the requests for money, the inconsistencies in Michael's timeline, the questionable origin of the forged medical certificate, and finally the handwriting analysis that declared the alleged letter from Margaret to be fraudulent. Piece by piece, the image of the dutiful son collapsed, replaced by a portrait of manipulation and greed. The gallery murmured, the judge's expression hardened, and Michael, for the first time in his polished career, lost his composure, his voice rising, his arguments tumbling over themselves in desperation. It was in that moment, with the weight of truth bearing down, that I felt a surge of both sorrow and vindication. Sorrow because the boy I had raised, the man I had once been proud of, now stood exposed as a liar in open court, and vindication because I had refused to be erased, because my voice, trembling though it sometimes was, had broken through the web he had tried to weave around me. When Judge Hughes delivered his words, declaring the petition for guardianship denied, affirming my full competence and ordering an investigation into the fraudulent documents submitted, the gavel's strike reverberated like thunder. The courtroom exhaled, and I sat there not in triumph, but in a solemn recognition that justice had been restored at terrible personal cost. Michael turned to me then, his face pale, his eyes filled not with remorse but with a cold, burning hatred, and in that look I saw the final severing of whatever bond remained between us. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and stormed out of the courtroom, reporters trailing him, while I remained seated, exhausted, my cane leaning against the witness box, feeling as though the years had doubled upon my shoulders, yet my dignity had been restored. The climax had arrived, not with shouting or chaos, but with the simple force of truth made undeniable, and though the cost was the loss of my son, the gain was the preservation of myself. When I returned home after the trial, the house felt different, though nothing had physically changed. The same creaking floorboards, the same photographs on the mantel, the same books lined up in their shelves, yet the air itself seemed lighter as though a heavy shadow that had hung over me for months had finally lifted, and I walked slowly from room to room, touching the familiar surfaces, letting my hand rest on the back of Margaret's chair at the kitchen table, feeling her presence more vividly than I had in years. For the first time since her death, I did not feel as though I were living in a mausoleum, but in a home that still belonged to me, a space reclaimed from the silent threat of dispossession. The judgment of the court had not only affirmed my competence, but had returned to me something more fundamental, the right to be the author of my own final years. Yet the victory was not without its ache, for as I sat in the evening light, sipping tea from the mug Margaret had once favored, I understood that my son was lost to me in a way that no ruling could repair. He had chosen greed over blood, power over love, and in so doing had severed a bond that had taken a lifetime to build. I thought of him as a boy, of the nights I carried him on my shoulders, of the way his small hand once gripped mine with absolute trust, and the memory stabbed me with a grief sharper than any courtroom defeat could have delivered. The court had given me freedom, but freedom came paired with the certainty that I would walk the remainder of my road without the companionship of the child for whom I had once sacrificed so much. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived from neighbors, from old students who had seen the news, from colleagues long retired, offering words of encouragement, some praising my courage, others sharing their own quiet stories of family betrayals. As though my ordeal had unlocked something long buried in their lives, I read each one carefully, placing them beside Margaret's old letters in the shoebox, building a strange archive of voices that reminded me that truth once spoken can ripple outward beyond the walls of a courtroom. At the same time, the press continued to circle Michael, reports surfacing of improprieties in other cases, whispers of disciplinary review, and though part of me wanted to shield him, to intervene, I forced myself to stay silent, recognizing that some consequences must fall where they are earned. It was during those quiet evenings that I made the decision about my will. Sitting at the old oak desk in the study, I drafted the document that would ensure my house and savings would not pass into Michael's hands, but instead be given to the university where I had taught for decades, establishing a scholarship in Margaret's name for students of history, young men and women who might carry forward the values we both cherished: integrity, curiosity, truth. The act of writing it steadied me, for it transformed my loss into a legacy, a way to ensure that even after I was gone, something of me and of her would endure untarnished. And so life settled into a new rhythm, quieter, but not empty. I tended the garden with renewed purpose, pruning the roses until they bloomed again, their fragrance drifting through the open windows like a benediction. I walked the neighborhood with my cane, greeting those who now looked at me not with pity but with respect, and in those moments I felt the dignity of survival. At night, when I lay down in bed, I still reached for the empty pillow beside me, whispering goodnight to Margaret, but the whisper no longer carried despair. It carried gratitude, for her voice had guided me even from beyond the grave, reminding me to stand firm. The trial had ended, the petition denied, but the true resolution lay not in the gavel strike but in the clarity it brought me. That dignity is not given by others but claimed, that love cannot be coerced by blood if the heart has turned cold, and that even in the autumn of one's life there remains the power to choose, to act, to define oneself. I had faced humiliation, betrayal, and the threat of erasure, yet I had not been erased. I was still here, still Arthur Caldwell, still the man Margaret loved, still the teacher who believed in truth. And as I closed my eyes each night, I felt not the weight of years pressing me toward silence, but the quiet strength of a life reclaimed.